In 1968, a French bomb exploded. This was called Canopus, and it marked the moment France joined the thermonuclear elite. But to understand why France detonated one of the largest bombs in human history, halfway across the world, and what that meant for the people living under its shadow, we need to go back. By the late 1950s, France was no longer the superpower it once was. The empire had shrunk, the colonies were breaking away, and while the United States, the Soviet Union, and even Britain flexed their nuclear muscles, France stood on the outside, watching history unfold without a seat at the table. This wasn't just about bombs anymore. It was about power, status, and national identity. French President Charles de Gaulle had made one thing clear: France must be strong. France must be independent. And in the language of the Cold War, that meant one thing: thermonuclear weapons. France's first nuclear test had taken place in 1960, during the final days of colonial Algeria. The device, Gerboise Bleu, had yielded about 70 kilotons, a massive blast for a first-timer, and a clear sign of intent. But even as French officials celebrated, they knew one bomb wasn't enough. In order to be respected or feared on the world stage, France needed a hydrogen bomb, a real one. But there was a problem. The Algerian War was heating up, and testing atomic weapons on North African soil was rapidly becoming a political nightmare. International condemnation was mounting. Local protests had already derailed plans for Corsica, and underground testing sites were still years away. So by the mid-1960s, France began looking elsewhere. They needed a place that was remote, under French control, and outside of Europe's critical gaze. They found it in the South Pacific. Thousands of miles from Paris, the French colonial territory of French Polynesia offered the perfect solution. The islands were isolated, sparsely populated, and most importantly, unprotected. Mururoa Atoll was chosen as the centerpiece. It was a narrow ring of land in the middle of the ocean, ringed with coral and surrounded by deep water. So on paper, it seemed ideal. But the people who lived nearby, in Tahiti, Mangareva, and Turea, weren't really asked. In fact, they weren't even told what was coming. As engineers and military crews began arriving on Mururoa to build roads, bunkers, airstrips, and control centers, the official narrative was vague. French scientists, they said, were studying ocean weather, conducting geological surveys, improving navigation systems. What they were really building was a launch pad for a thermonuclear demonstration. But this wasn't going to be a small step into the hydrogen age. France didn't want a test. They wanted a show, and that's what they planned to deliver, with a bomb named after the brightest star in the southern sky, Canopus. But how do you design a bomb meant to impress the entire planet? From the size of the warhead to the way it would be dropped, every part of the operation had been designed to send a message, not just to enemies, but to allies, to doubters, and to history. The bomb itself was massive. It used a classic two-stage thermonuclear design, with a fission primary triggering a fusion secondary, the same setup as America's Ivy Mike or the Soviet Union's Tsar Bomba. The fuel used was lithium deuteride, which is the standard ingredient in modern hydrogen bombs. But the real difference was the scale. Canopus was designed to yield 2.6 megatons. That's more than 173 Hiroshimas, packed into one device, and it would be detonated not underground, not on a test range, but in the atmosphere, 600 meters above Mururoa Atoll. The French military constructed a network of control centers and observation stations around the island. They also invited journalists, political observers, and foreign military attachés, just close enough to witness the event, but far enough to be kept away from the technical details. They called the whole operation Centaur, and like a Greek myth, it was equal parts brilliance and brutality. On August 24, 1968, a Mirage 4 bomber, France's premier nuclear aircraft, took off from Howe Island carrying the 3-ton Canopus device under its wing. The flight crew was briefed, the countdown was synchronized, and the airspace was cleared. At exactly 6:30 a.m. local time, the bomb was released over Mururoa. It descended slowly, attached to a parachute designed to delay detonation just long enough for the bomber to escape. Then, at 600 meters above the atoll, it exploded. The mushroom cloud rose over 50,000 feet, punching into the stratosphere and sending radioactive material into the global jet stream. The shock wave rolled across the Pacific in seconds. People hundreds of kilometers away reported seeing the sky turn white. And France had its answer. The bomb worked. The scientists at the French Atomic Energy Commission had finally joined the hydrogen elite. And President Charles de Gaulle had what he wanted: a true thermonuclear weapon, and proof that France could defend itself, without NATO, without Washington, without Moscow. But behind the happy headlines was something else, something scary and disturbing. In the official French reports, Operation Canopus was a success, but internal memos and later declassified documents told a different story. The radioactive cloud didn't stay neatly above the ocean. It spread, caught in upper atmosphere wind currents, and dispersed across thousands of kilometers. Within hours, trace radiation was detected as far away as Samoa. Within days, it had reached South America. And within 2 weeks, isotopes from Canopus were showing up in rainwater samples across the southern hemisphere. On the ground in French Polynesia, the effects were even more direct. Villagers on islands like Mangareva, just 150 kilometers from the blast site, later reported milky rain, burning eyes, and metallic-tasting water in the days after the test. Livestock began getting sick. Coconut palms dropped their fruit early. And still, there was no warning. The French military had promised locals that the test would be harmless. They distributed leaflets reassuring communities that no radioactive danger existed, but they never distributed iodine pills, protective masks, or evacuation orders. Instead, many residents were told simply to stay indoors and close their windows, even though most homes were open air and made of wood or palm thatch. In 2006, an investigative report by French newspaper Le Parisien uncovered classified radiation maps from the Canopus test. The maps showed contamination zones stretching over inhabited islands, contradicting decades of official denials. According to those documents, the gamma radiation levels recorded on nearby islands were more than 200 times higher than safe limits. The human cost started to emerge over the years and then decades. By the 1980s, cancer clusters began appearing among former test site workers, military personnel, and local residents. Rates of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and birth defects surged in areas downwind of the blasts. Many of those exposed were never informed, never treated, and never compensated. In 2013, a French parliamentary report confirmed what survivors had been saying for decades. France had knowingly exposed its own citizens and colonial subjects to dangerous radiation levels and had covered up the effects for years. But why hide it? For years, the French government insisted that the Canopus test had no long-term effects on local populations. They stuck to the script. The yield was contained. The fallout was minimal and no civilians were harmed. But in the villages of Mangareva, Ricatea, and Turea, people were getting sick. Children developed strange skin conditions. Adults complained of chronic fatigue, vision loss, and tumors. Pregnant women began miscarrying at higher rates, and stillbirths became tragically common. Families had no medical history to explain it, and no warning that radiation might be the reason. So why wasn't anyone talking about it? Well, because silence was policy. After Canopus, the French Ministry of Defense launched a strict information lockdown. Medical staff assigned to the islands were ordered not to share data with local communities. Test site workers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. and anyone caught leaking details about radiation exposure could face prison time. Even the French press, typically aggressive on government accountability, hesitated. Nuclear testing was considered a matter of national security, and investigations were discouraged behind the scenes. One journalist from Le Monde, who tried to publish fallout data in the early 70s, had their article pulled at the last minute due to state sensitivities. But the survivors weren't imagining it, and the data wasn't going away. In 1998, a group of retired military personnel broke rank and submitted testimonies to the Assemblée Nationale, claiming that internal radiation monitors had failed during Canopus. One engineer described being told to bury contaminated topsoil and leave no trace. Then came the whistleblowers. In 2005, a former technician named Roland Oldham released a personal archive of internal memos and dose reports. His documents showed that radiation levels in nearby villages far exceeded safety thresholds, and that French officials had known this for decades. But what really shocked investigators was this: there were no follow-up health screenings for the residents at all. Once the tests were done, so was the oversight. But if the science was being hidden and the victims ignored, what was all this secrecy really protecting? The truth was, Canopus wasn't just a bomb, it was a performance. And performances need control. To understand the cover-up, you have to understand the stakes. In 1966, just 2 years before the test, Charles de Gaulle had pulled France out of NATO's integrated military command. He wanted France to act independently, free from Washington's orbit. But that independence came at a cost. France had to prove it could defend itself without American help. Canopus was that proof. It wasn't just a demonstration of nuclear physics, it was a declaration of nuclear sovereignty, and that meant it couldn't fail. Not technically, and definitely not morally. So when fallout began affecting local populations, acknowledging it would have unraveled the whole story. It would have raised awkward questions. Was France still acting like a colonial power in Polynesia? Were the lives of Pacific Islanders sacrificed for European prestige? Was the force de frappe built on silence? The government's solution was elegant and brutal. It buried the problem. Environmental records were sealed. Military archives were classified. Compensation claims were redirected or denied. And for decades, the victims had no way to fight back. But the illusion didn't hold forever. By the 2000s, independent researchers began analyzing satellite weather data from 1968 to model fallout trajectories. Their findings confirmed what the locals had said all along. The radiation had spread much farther and much faster than France ever admitted. In 2010, the French Parliament finally passed a law acknowledging that certain test victims could apply for compensation. But the criteria were so strict and the documentation requirements so heavy that fewer than 1% of applicants were approved. And even then, most of those approved were former soldiers. So if the tests had finally been acknowledged, why were so few people actually being helped? What was France still trying to protect? In 2013, a French journalist filed a formal request to access Ministry of Defense records on Canopus. He was denied. The reason? The data was still classified 45 years after the test. When researchers from the Atomic Veterans Association and French Polynesian advocacy groups asked for internal radiation logs, they ran into the same wall. Despite mounting evidence of health effects and international pressure for transparency, the French government continued to treat Canopus like a matter of active national security. But the leaks didn't stop. A 2015 investigation by Disclose and Radio France Internationale obtained portions of declassified reports that showed something chilling. French scientists at the time of the test had underestimated the atmospheric reach of Canopus by over 200 kilometers. That meant schools, fishing grounds, and fresh water sources downwind of the detonation had likely received unaccounted for doses of radiation. It also meant internal government estimates of exposure, used to deny compensation for decades, were based on false models. And the deception wasn't just bureaucratic. In one internal memo, military officials expressed concern that foreign scientists might detect isotopic drift inconsistent with public yield statements. In simple terms, they were worried other countries might realize the Canopus bomb had released far more radiation than admitted. So they buried the data. And the burden fell on scientists decades later, researchers with no access to primary file, to reconstruct what really happened. By 2017, a new wave of French scholars began publishing independent fallout simulations based on weather patterns, soil samples, and oral testimonies. Their conclusion: at least 110,000 people in the region had likely experienced direct or indirect exposure to Canopus fallout. But the real number? That's still buried in locked cabinets in Paris. But the truth had a way of leaking out. In 2016, French President François Hollande made a historic visit to Tahiti. He offered what the media called a carefully worded apology for France's nuclear testing program. He acknowledged the pain of the past. He called for greater recognition, but he stopped short of promising reparations or declassifying documents. For many, it felt like a public relations event, not justice. The government followed up by creating a compensation fund, but the structure was deeply flawed. Victims had to prove they were in high-exposure zones, zones still defined by the very maps the government had been accused of falsifying. Many islanders had no medical records, no test results, no documentation to back up their claims. And even when they could provide evidence, the review process was slow and inconsistent. One Tahitian woman, whose father had worked as a base technician during Canopus, submitted over 500 pages of health records and personal logs showing his repeated contact with contaminated equipment. Her claim was rejected due to insufficient causal evidence, and she wasn't alone. By 2020, of the thousands of claims submitted, less than 2% were approved. Meanwhile, French territories in the Pacific continued to struggle with underfunded hospitals, elevated cancer rates, and little environmental monitoring. The soil in some areas still tested positive for long-lived isotopes like cesium-137, which can remain hazardous for up to 300 years. And the promises of infrastructure investment and environmental cleanup? Most never arrived. Canopus had been detonated with fanfare, media coverage, and full military ceremony, but its aftermath was managed in whispers and denials. And those who still live in its shadow are left wondering, what does nuclear power really mean when the people it affects are treated like they never mattered? Canopus was the last atmospheric test France ever conducted. After 1968, France moved its nuclear program underground, first at Mururoa, then Fangataufa, where tests continued in silence until 1996. By then, over 210 nuclear detonations had been carried out across French Polynesia. But Canopus was different. It wasn't just a test. It was a pivot point. The moment when France crossed the threshold into full thermonuclear capability. It changed how the world viewed France's military. It earned the country a louder voice in NATO. It secured de Gaulle's dream of strategic independence. But it also marked something else. The end of deniability. Because after Canopus, there was no pretending anymore. France had chosen to detonate the most powerful weapon in its history in one of the most biologically sensitive regions on Earth, and to do so with limited safety infrastructure, no transparent oversight, and no real plan for the people who lived nearby. Even today, researchers and advocates are still piecing together the long-term damage. The tapu zones, forbidden or dangerous areas of the atolls, are slowly growing, not shrinking. Families have been displaced. Graves have had to be relocated. And still, no comprehensive epidemiological study has been conducted by the French government. So as much as Canopus helped elevate France politically, it left behind an invisible crater. In the end, Canopus didn't just test the limits of nuclear design, it tested the limits of trust. Trust between governments and the people they govern, between science and secrecy, between a nation's military ambitions and its human consequences. France became a nuclear power with Canopus, but it also became something else. A case study in how far a modern democracy will go to bury the cost of its own power. The real legacy of Canopus won't be found in declassified files or test yields. It lives in the silence, the carefully crafted absences that still shape French policy in the Pacific today.